Hi class, and welcome to your next video screencast on fungi. Today we're going to be talking about asexual reproduction and we're going to talk about classification. So let's go ahead and get started with asexual reproduction. Okay, there are three types of asexual reproduction. Fragmentation, which is part of the mycelium becoming separated and begins a life of its own. So it's just kind of budding off there. Now, it's not the same thing as budding. Budding, a small cell forms and gets pinched off as it grows to full size. This is what yeast use, and there's a picture here of yeast budding off. And then asexual spores are production of spores by a single mycelium, and these are going to be used asexually versus sexually, is where we talked about spores before. So let's talk about spores first. Spores are formed directly on the hyphae. They are inside the sporangia and they occur on fruiting bodies. So if you can see the pilobus sporangia right here, they're making those spores, those dark bluish, blackish things. Those are going to be spores. Now, fruiting bodies are modified hyphae that make these asexual spores, and they're an upright stalk called the sporangiospore, and it supports this spore and it supports the spore case or a sporangia. So what it's doing is it's able to sit up right here and it makes those spores, and eventually those spores are going to burst and they're going to be dispersed by natural causes. So we have types of fruiting bodies. We have three types of fruiting bodies: Basidia, sporangia, and ascus. And actually, we will see when we do classification that this is one of the ways we classify our fungus. So let's start with fruiting bodies. They're composed of hyphae and mycelium, just like we keep seeing. We see all those hyphae in the mycelia, and the hyphae will grow from a spore. So what happens is you have this single spore and it starts to germinate and eventually creates your mycelium and network, and it also creates those hyphae. So mycelia have a huge surface area. Remember when we drew it on the board what it looked like, and earlier in your other video cast. More surface area is going to aid in its digestion and absorption of food, and it's also going to help with its growth. Remember, the end of that mycelium is actually very, very plastic. So let's go over the major groups of fungus. So within the past few years, several groups have been reclassified into protists. Two of these groups are the slime molds and the water molds. Actually, the reason we did this is because we saw that it was more closely related to the protist than it was the fungus based on DNA evidence. So we actually classify by nutrition. Remember, we've already talked about these saprobes, these decomposers, and what those are molds, are mushrooms, things that grow where something is dying. So if you get a moldy orange, that orange is dying. Mushrooms grow where we have dead and decaying matter, and that dead and decaying matter generally is manure. We have parasites. Remember, we saw that it could be a parasite-host relationship with the fungus. Well, we have parasites that are going to harm the host. Rust and smuts are going to be something like that. And then we have mutualistic type fungus. Now, you might have never thought that a fungus could be mutualistic, but in actuality it is, and a lichen is an example of that. Anytime you see that green stuff on a tree bark, you're seeing lichen. Okay, so let's talk about the major groups we have of fungi. We have Basidium micata, the club fungi, or this is what you see as a mushroom. The zygomycota is going to be your bread mold. That's where you're going to see that moldiness from the bread. The chytrid mycota, the AM fungi or mycorrhizas, the ascomycota, which look like a sack. It's going to kind of look like this. So, and then finally we have the lichens, which is actually a symbiosis between algae and fungi. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So here is a general picture of a zygomycota, and these are called the sporangium fungi, basically because of how they reproduce. They're commonly called molds, so you might have seen some mold, and include blights. Hyphae have no cross walls, so they're aseptate. So remember, when they go through mitosis, they're actually going, they're not going through cytokinesis, they're becoming multinucleated cells. They grow very, very rapidly, and they include bread mold, Rhizopus stolonifer. Now, anything else that you see on plants that looks like this fuzziness is probably going to belong to the Zygomycota. So, they have asexual reproductive structures called sporangium, like I told you. They use sporangium a lot to reproduce. And this is the sporangiospores, which make the spores. So we have the sporangium right here, we have the sporangiophore, and the spores are going to be in the sporangium. So rhizoids, remember, anchor the mold and release digestive enzymes and absorb food. So this is going to be the root-like structure, and stolons connect the fruiting bodies. So remember, that goes horizontally. So continuing on with this Zygomycota, sexual spores are produced by conjugation when plus and minus hyphae fuse. So remember, no male or female here, it's just using plus and minus. And sexual spores are called zygospores. Zygospores endure harsh environments. Remember, we go through sexual reproduction when we go into a harsh area and there's not enough moisture, there's not enough nutrition, and then we're going to fuse using this hyphae conjugation. So the next one, Basidiomycota, or the club fungi. This is where we're going to see our mushrooms. Like I just said, it's called the club fungi. It includes mushrooms, which you might eat, toadstools, bracket and shell fungi, puffballs, stinkhorns, rusts, and smuts. This is actually what what people think of as fungi. Most people don't think of molds and all of that, even though it's pretty inherent that they are. A lot of people don't think of these other classifications as fungi. So some are used as food, your mushrooms, your portobello, you might have had baby bella, all kinds of different mushrooms, cremini, but others are going to damage your crops. So rust and smuts, these are actually damaging to your crops, and they're doing what all of the other Basidiomycetes do, but the way they go about it is they're damaging. So they seldom reproduce asexually, which is interesting for a fungus. Most fungus try and reproduce asexually. The visible mushroom is actually the fruiting body, and the basidiocarp is made of a stalk called the stipe and a flattened cap with gills called the basidia underneath. So if you've looked at a mushroom, taken it apart, if you have some mushroom in your refrigerator, go ahead and look at it and identify that basidiocarp, the stipe, the cap, and the basidia underneath. The basidiospores are found on the basidia, and the annulus is a skirt-like ring around some of the stipes, so not all of them are going to have this. And it has vegetative structures found below the ground. Remember that mycelium, the rhizoids, all those are going to be under the ground. So this is the life cycle. If we start where it has meiosis, right about here, and we go through this, we start at N. See that? And we're going to go through, and we're going to have haploid mycelium, and then we're actually going to fuse. And the mycelium are fruiting, and they become dikaryotic. Dikaryotic is N plus N, which is actually different than 2N. And eventually, we're going to have a nuclear fusion. So at this point, we have N plus N. We have that fusion of the haploid in the mycelia. But right now, they're dikaryotic. We have not fused that nuclei. And once we fuse that nuclei, we become 2N. So that's something important to know, that dikaryotic is not when we have that nuclear fusion. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. And we're going to go to the ascomycetes, or the sac fungi. So like I just said, it's called the sac fungi. It includes cup fungi, morsels, truffles, yeast, and mildew. We do eat truffles. They are a very special type of fungus. And actually, they are a very expensive type of fungus because they only grow in certain regions of the world, such as Tuscany in Italy. They may be plant parasites. They reproduce both sexually and asexually, and they produce an ascus. It's a sac that makes ascospores in sexual reproduction, and is specialized hyphae known as ascocarps, which contain the asci in them. So those structures are pretty important. For our characteristics, they reproduce by budding, just like the yeast that we were just talking about. Asexual spores called conidia form on the tips of special hyphae known as conidiophores, and this is for the sac fungi, guys. So conidia formation, you're going to see all of these spores right through here, and then we're going to see the conidia out here, and it's eventually going to be able to spread out. So here's a picture of yeast budding. And how do we use ascomycetes? Well, truffles and morels are good examples of edible ascomycetes. What you're seeing right here, over here in these pictures. And that's what's a very, very exotic type mushroom, and it's actually very expensive. Penicillium mold makes the antibiotic penicillin, but we talked about in class how we are becoming resistant to this penicillin mold. Some ascomycetes also give flavor to your cheeses. Your cheeses are made with fungus. And Saccharomyces cerevisiae is used to make bread rise and to ferment your beer and wine. So the next one is Chytridium micata, and commonly we just call this a chytrid. They have motile spores, which is very interesting. Remember, in our characteristics they were non-motile, but their spores here are motile. They're mostly saprodes and parasites in aquatic habitats, and they biodegrade and recycle nutrients, meaning they are decomposers. So here's the mycorrhizae, and the mycorrhizae is a fungus associated with plant roots. It's a mutualism between a fungus and a plant. So the fungus is nutrient and water uptake for the plant, whereas the plant provides carbohydrate for the fungus to live off of. There are several kinds. The zygomycota hyphae invade the root cells, and the ascomycota or basidiomycota are in the hyphae, invade the root, but don't penetrate the cells. They're extremely important ecologically, and some of the things you might eat, like peanuts or peas, all of these are coming from these mycorrhizae, and without these different types of fungus, you would not have them because they're living in a symbiotic relationship. So now we have lichens. Lichens, like I mentioned before, are going to be that greenish, whitish, goldish color that you're seeing on trees. And it's a mutualism between the fungus, which provides the structure, and algae or cyanobacteria, which provides the food. Remember, the algae or cyanobacteria can easily produce that food with the sun, and it's going to provide the food for the fungus as well. It forms the thallus, and we have 3 different kinds. We have foliose, fruticose, and crustose. So here's an example of what it's going to look like. These green portions are actually your cyanobacteria, where and you're going to see the brownish yellowish, which is the hyphae, and that's, remember, keeping the form. So lichens as biomonitors, the thalli or the thallus acts like a sponge, and some species are more sensitive than others to pollutants. So we can see when our lichens are starting to die off that our pollution is getting too high. Which species are present can indicate the air quality. So if we look at the actual species within the lichen, we can predict the air quality because of how sensitive one species or another is to air quality. And lastly, most resistant species can also be analyzed for pollutants. Okay, that's it for fungus. We will be having a quiz on this, so study up and come to class prepared.